Good evening. Hello, my name is Patsy Stockman. I'm the Career Services Coordinator here at Kansas Wesleyan University, and it is my deep honor to welcome you here tonight, whether you are here in person or on the live stream, to the campus of Kansas Wesleyan University, to our beautiful Sam's Chapel, for a little sense of normalcy. We actually have a guest speaker. So it is my honor to introduce Amee Quiriconi. She is a podcaster, entrepreneur, business person. I mean, everything. I just go through everything that she has done and some of the research that she has done, and it's amazing. So this presentation this evening is geared more towards the launch of her new book, The Fearless Woman's Guide to Starting a Business. Tonight we will be giving away 2 of her books to our in-person guests. You should have received a ticket when you came in. The books are autographed. I also want to make sure that you were given an index card, just a typical white index card. At the end of the presentation, we will be doing a Q&A. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask Amee, we will pick those up about 15 minutes until the about 7:45. No, 7:15? Whatever, 7:15. And I lose track of time. And we will allow her to answer any questions. So through her study in the fields of neuroscience, psychology, and self-improvement, Amee is bringing a thought-provoking harmony of practical business strategies with the underlying drives that affect people and with their success, again, with her new book. So without further ado, I would like a great big KWU welcome, and to those of you on live stream, I can hear you in your living rooms, to Amee Quiriconi. Thank you.
Yay! Awesome. I don't know if you guys could hear me like breathing through my nose through the microphone in the back while I was snickering here. So I get it, first of all, that when it's a warm day in an old building like this, that sometimes we can get a little bit like kind of mopey, especially at the end of the day here. So I want to thank everybody that's here to be able to listen, and everybody that's actually watching on the live stream, and the people that will be watching this a little bit later. I appreciate you guys doing this. As Patsy mentioned, I actually grew up in Salina, and I did not go to Kansas Wesleyan. I'm actually a Wildcat. I went to K-State over in Manhattan. And so I understand, again, like when the weather turns nice, how people can kind of want to go outside and how it can be hot. I appreciate the chance to be able to speak here tonight, and before I do that, I want to say thank you again to Kansas Wesleyan University for being able to do something like this, because it's pretty awesome to be able to have an event when we've been kind of secluded for many months now. And so for those of you that braved it out here with your masks and your 7 feet between you and the next person, thank you very much for doing that. And to the KWU student media team that's doing the live stream here this evening, and the faculty that's involved with that, thank you so much for all of that. So I want to be able to chat with you guys tonight about some of the things that I've learned, through the course of my business experience, as Patsy mentioned. Back in 1949, an author, Joseph Campbell, wrote a book called A Hero with a Thousand Faces, and it is the story of the tale of the myth and the mythology and the narrative. He actually wrote that a hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a reign of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with power to bestow the boons on his fellow man. And this narrative describes the plot of many of the world's greatest stories and myths that have been ever told. And it's actually used quite often in personal coaching and business coaching, sometimes in therapy, because it's a way to be able to bring meaning to a person's adventures or misadventures. And in a cool way, it's a way that we're able to reflect and add a positive spin on some of our life experiences. And so I'm going to use this narrative pattern today to tell you a little bit about my hero's journey and about how I answered a call to adventure, how I fought many battles, how some of them I won and some I lost, and how I had to combine my inquisitive nature of how the world works and how humans work with the idea that sometimes I had to let the streams of the universe speak to me and be willing to explore other directions with full faith that in the end I was going to be transformed and that I was going to be okay. And then finally now, where figuratively, and in my case actually literally, I have returned to my childhood home so that I can share with you some of the things that I learned along the way. Now, my first call to adventure came in 1995 when I graduated from Kansas State. And I decided that at that time, what I needed was as many miles as I could get between me and this town. And so in the 1990s, Seattle was actually the coolest city in the world with lots of opportunities. And so this Kansas girl went off to the Emerald City. And I spent years in engineering. I actually got a degree in architectural engineering. And in the 90s, Seattle would actually become one of the first cities to employ green building standards or sustainable building practices. And the supernatural voice that I heard told me to learn more about this because I had zero experience with it growing up here in Kansas. So I started in a certificate program to get a Sustainable Building Advisor certificate. And then when that wasn't enough, the instructor recommended a master's program. And so I enrolled at the Environment and Community program at Antioch University in Seattle. And then that's when the entrepreneurship journey actually began. What started as an economics paper turned into a business plan, and then that turned into a nagging voice inside of my head, maybe those supernatural powers, that said to me, if this is such a good idea, then why isn't anybody else doing it? And so the rocky and exciting adventure of entrepreneurship began in 2003. That year I invented a countertop in my garage that literally from garbage and sold $500,000 a year. It diverted millions of tons of trash from the waste stream. I turned trash into money. That was my first call to adventure. And I sold it to supermodels and rock stars. But I lost it all 8 years later. And it was shortly after my marriage ended, I blamed it on the extreme pressures of the recession and many other things that I will hint about a little later. Right after that, I ended up moving to the country, and I ended up taking a backyard wedding venue business that was earning less than $10,000 a year, and I grew it into an award-winning 6-figure business in less than 2 years. But then expanded it to 2 locations, tripled revenues, and over 5 years it would earn over $2 million in gross sales. This business had gone from losing money to making a ridiculous amount of money. And so it would seem that I knew a little bit of something about starting businesses at kitchen tables and turning them into multi-million-dollar levels, which is why sometimes I would be hired as a business coach, or people would come to the classrooms or the conferences I was speaking at to hear what I had to say. But the reason that I'm taking the time tonight to share with you my story is because I know how to do all of those amazing things and have absolutely nothing to show for it. Because in 2017, I would lose it all again. And it was another relationship, it was another business, and I knew that I couldn't blame a recession or a terrible business partner or a lousy marriage again on all those problems. Instead, I stood in the wake of loss and I saw for the first time that it was all on me. I didn't know why it was, but my mathematical brain could see a pattern, and that I was the common denominator in the rising and the falling of everything that I did. I had lots of verifiable successes on the business front to point to. Television appearances, magazine features, famous customers, on and on, all the things that some people dream about getting. But once it was said and done, I had nothing but a box of memories in my hands, and I had to go find a new place to start all over again. I wasn't wealthy like I imagined I would be. I wasn't happy. I was stressed. I was broke, and I thought I was destined to never get what I really wanted. I truly believed that I was cursed with having amazing and big ideas, but they were never going to be mine to keep. I would be able to dream up fantasies, turn it into money, but there wasn't money that I was going to be able to make for myself. And that's when I sat on my couch and I decided that I was going to use my curious and creative mind on just me for once. And I was going to solve the puzzle of what was happening. And I spent 2 years doing that. But a funny thing happened while on the journey of personal self-discovery. Lightning struck again. After 4 months into this healing process, feeling this intense sense of purpose, I was compelled to share what I was learning with others. So I decided to start a podcast called One Broken Mom. And in only 1 year, I went from reading these life-changing books to actually meeting and interviewing the very authors on my show. And several of these women and men would go from being the names on the covers of my favorite books to professional colleagues and friends. But it was after spending a couple of years immersed in the field of psychology, neuroscience, self-help, all while continuing to coach women business owners and other business owners, I began to see the natural intersection between the two more clearly. My reasons for my failure were not actually mine alone, and that's when I knew I needed to do something about it, and that's when my transformation began to happen. My passion my entire life has been to cheer on underdogs. I have always felt like a superhero, not because of an overinflated ego, but because when the odds are stacked against someone, which is the case in entrepreneurship and business, and more so for women, it's nice to know that someone out there has your back. And ever since I was a little girl, I have felt like that was my job. But my character has this other side to it, which is I hate the idea of always having to save people when I know there's a way to change the system. So I study, I stay curious, I stay rebellious. And if you tell me something and my gut tells me something differently, I'll figure out who's right, and then I'll try to tell the world all about it. So I guess sometimes I'm not much of a superhero, as maybe just a vigilante. And so I thought about the question of what does it take to really be successful in business? And the truth is that's a tough question, one that I kind of know the answers to, one that I'm actually building expertise on right now. And what I learned was that I definitely knew how to fail. And I decided that what I wanted to do was to write a book, and of all the stuff that I wished I'd known before I started and then started and failed again at my own companies. Because I had talent, good research, great people management skills. I was a closer when it came to sales. I had long-term visioning and planning. I had good cash flow projections and budget management. I had all of it. But in the end, I didn't know myself as well as I knew target markets, customers, or even employees. And so yes, you will find in life there are lots of business teachers who have had challenges in life and then fast-track themselves to success, and I am not that teacher. Instead, my experience is built from the rubble of failures. And I think that that's actually a good thing when people get into entrepreneurship, because most people are going to fail many, many times. And when they read books and take courses that are taught by people who make it look easy, maybe even a little too easy, and they can't still pull off on their own success, it begins to reinforce this sense of shame inside of ourselves that we're not good enough. And I just can't stand for that. And I don't think it's fair, not when I know that there's a truth out there and I believe I know how I can help them. So what are the lessons that I've returned home in this mythological journey with you guys to share? Well, over the years, I've noticed that there are some major skills that we have to have in business. And they're like the legs of a three-legged stool. And sometimes clients hired me because they might be a little wobbly on one of these legs and they're wanting a coach or a business consultant to be able to help make up the difference. But being balanced in business is very successful. So those are things like organization and planning skills, having the ability to be able to develop long-range and short-term plans, but also to be able to turn plans into actual actions and to be able to reach goals. You need to have leadership and people skills. And even if you never want to have employees, if you end up becoming an entrepreneur and being a solopreneur, it's still vital because we have to engage with people on a pretty regular basis. So this is about how we communicate, how we conduct meetings, whether it's in writing, on the phone, or in person, and how do we negotiate and be persuasive. And then the last leg of the stool is financial management. And we realize that a business that doesn't make money isn't going to stay in business for very long. But it's not just about having financial literacy, but it's about knowing that there are other parts that can undermine us with our financial success. Like, do you pay your bills on time? And do you know how to avoid the cost of late fees and penalties? Do you know how to set budgets and stick to budgets? Are you able to forecast spending? Are you able to predict price fluctuations, sales targets? So when we take the three legs of a stool, and then we take a look at why do businesses fail, I want to be first sure to clarify something. That a business doesn't actually fail, it's people, right? Like we've got people inside of businesses. And so for one reason or another, business owners will decide that they can't continue on. But the funny thing is that a lot of businesses will make it through their first year. In fact, when the Small Business Association's Office of Advocacy published their data from 2019, and I get it, COVID, pandemic, kind of new numbers here, they still found that 4 out of 5 businesses that had started in 2017 actually made it all the way into 2018. So if you decide that you're going to go start a business, the odds are really in your favor. You're going to make it a year. But after that, they started to drop. So the odds are good that you'll go a first year, but then over several years, half of all businesses, and you may have heard this if you're business students, will fail at least in 5 years. And then only a third of businesses will actually make it out to the 10-year anniversary mark. So what is happening in the first 5 years or in the startup phase? Well, one of the results that I used is from CB Insights, and it's a company that provides market and business intelligence information. And they talked to entrepreneur startups and postmortems from 2019, and they asked them what were the reasons why they closed their business. And as they sifted through the answers, they found 20 basic reasons that were given in one way or another. Things like we closed down because there was no market need, we ran out of cash, we lost focus, we had disharmony with our team and investors, we had the wrong people working for us, outcompeted, on and on and on. And what I noticed is that when we're looking at these reasons given, I thought they seemed to stem actually from people not having those 3 skills that I just talked about. In fact, the list has several reasons that could be bucketed into either it's a planning problem, it's a leadership problem, or it's a financial know-how problem. And so then that's when I began to reason that maybe something else was actually happening on why businesses don't make it. Because what's interesting about those figures is that the rates of failure are consistent throughout the years, even during economic recessions. That is, even during the recession, the one that happened 10 years ago, or longer than that, I say 10, was that in the years that followed, was that those failure rates didn't actually skyrocket during the recession. They remained steady, suggesting that economic factors don't have as much of a significance on the success of a small business as many people actually think. So then that tells me something, because again, businesses don't fail, but the people do. So, point of the discussion that we're going to get into is, I want to talk a little bit about then what's going on inside of our inner world. And the first thing that I want to ask you all to do is to forget the myth that our brains, when we're born, come out of the box ready to go. And that if we have emotional issues, I'm going to air quote that, or mental health issues, that it's because we got the bad luck of the straw and we were born with a bad model. This old idea is at the heart of treatments and stigmas around mental health and our viewpoints about mental illnesses in society, and that ends up keeping people closeted in shame when they're having difficulties or struggles. But what we do know over 40 years of psychology studies, and we can link it with 20 years of research into neuroscience and neurobiology, the evidence is that emotions and a lot of these things are behaviors come from a combination of nature, the things that we're born with, and nurture. And in fact, it was grasping this one thing that the science is there, but it's not well known. Like, we don't take neuroscience classes as a core curriculum for us. And it hasn't reached a saturation point in our society, is exactly why I ended up starting a podcast and to become a mental health advocate. But I also found it was important to bring this knowledge to the field of business because I knew this was information would change other people's lives. And so up until a few years ago, when scientists wanted to study how our brains worked, they had to study animals. They had to go out and watch primates or meerkats or any other creature out there and try to determine what was going on. But we, in the course that some of us were born and living, now our researchers have access to MRIs and CAT scans and a bunch of other scans I can't even pronounce. They could begin to non-invasively see inside human brains and measure changes to the brain on a millisecond by millisecond basis. Then, when we were able to map the DNA in 2003, boom, blew the doors off of what we know about our brains and our bodies. And so in my quest to understand the neuroscience, aside from journals and books and talking to people on my podcast, I began to collect all this information. Now, I am not a neuroscientist. I'm not a psychologist. I have an engineering degree, so the best I knew before was how to design buildings. So what I'm going to talk about today, I want to make sure I'm laying it out in a very practical and pragmatic way. But our brain is the organic computer in our head, and it is the software that runs our bodies 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And despite this idea to flip a switch from a business brain to the normal brain, we're all operating off of the one brain that's in our head. So, first thing that we should know is when we're born, the size of our brain is about 25% of the size it's going to be as an adult. But we're actually born with all the cells that we're going to need to actually put the brain together. The neurons are a special type of cell that we have that form the complex communication network that we use in our brains. The catch is that aside from core functions when we come out of the box, most of the synapses, which are the real physical connections between these cells, are not actually wired together yet. So I always think of it as pull your phone out, you can turn it on and it's got a few basic functions, but you have to get it going by starting adding apps to it, right? Based on what you like and what you need. Now, by the time we're 5 years old, our brains are about 95% of our adult size, which tells us that a ton of growth is actually happening in our first 5 years of our life. However, a 95% size adult brain does not mean it's a 95% developed adult brain, which we've hung out with 5-year-olds, so we actually know that that's true. But before the age of 3 years old, when we were 3 years old, the brain is extra sensitive, and it is soaking up an extraordinary amount of information. And it's the largest amount of neural wiring is actually happening before this age. In fact, some scientists estimate that there are 1 million connections per second that are being made, coming from every experience we have from birth to 3 years old. So think about it this way, because I worked in engineering and architecture. Think of the brain as architecture, like building a home. From birth to 5 years old, 95% of the house is built. The walls are up, the ceilings are in, the floors are in, the light switches are going in, and the light fixtures are installed. And how this house actually looks is based on the DNA. Is it a Spanish colonial? Is it Georgian? Whatever. But what's missing is the copper wiring between all those lights and light switches. The wiring is just laying there on the ground hanging loose and it isn't connected yet. An electrician needs to go in and start to tell it what to do. And that's where those experiences come into play. Our childhood experiences teach the electrician where to put copper wires, which lights will come on, and which switches need to be flipped. Now, a neuroscience that I talked to from the University of Washington adds that we don't even know when we're born what lights we're going to actually need. We're kind of born with a kit, right? And so we're not sure how we're going to use the house. So we don't know what part of the house might actually end up needing more light than other parts. And that's where all these experiences begin to develop there. So how does the electrician, again, get the information to wire the house up? Well, researchers and scientists believe that there's a specific strategy, and it's for these connections to be built through a process called serve and return. So according to Harvard Centered's University for the Developing Child, serve and return is like ping pong or tennis, whatever you want to do, lobbing a ball over from one side of a net to the other. In this case, a child serves. So we are the key here as a child. We babble, make a face, make a noise, break something, whatever it is. The other player, in this case, an adult, ideally our parent, responds to that, the return. If they respond appropriately by making eye contact with us, speaking back, hugging us, then the ball has been returned to us and the neural connection is made. We are born with this ability to connect. In the 1970s, Dr. Andrew Melton actually did a study where he went into hospitals, and with the parents' permissions, of course, started making faces at newborn babies. He stuck his tongue out, he opened his mouth, and he made these faces that a baby could actually make with their very, immature face muscles. And sure enough, many babies, not all, but most babies, within hours, were able to mimic those facial expressions back to him. Long before a child even knows what a tongue is and can say a word, they're born ready, biologically ready to start having this back and forth interaction that we know that is fundamental to brain development. And as I talk about this, I'd like you guys to think about this like this is you. I'm describing how you were made. So, because this back and forth interaction is essential to brain architecture, when it doesn't happen at all, or the responses are unreliable or inappropriate, what we're seeing in research is that the development of these neural connections then gets disruptive. It turns into possible physical, mental, and emotional impairments because they're not happening the way that the brain is designed to make them happen. In fact, the ongoing absence of serve and return, that is a child that constantly is attempting to connect with their primary caregiver, or any adult really, and it's not being answered, the child's stress response then gets activated. And the developing brain starts to get a double whammy of poor interactions and a body being flooded with harmful stress hormones. And why does this do this? Because this is how important these connections are to surviving. To humans, these connections are a matter of life and death. And so if serve and return isn't happening for a child, or it's done inconsistently and inappropriately, the brain senses danger. More particularly, if that child cannot make stable connections with an adult, it thinks that the child could die. Now, we know that children will perish without food and water, but it's only in the last 20 or 30 years, and for some of us, we were already done and born by that happened, that researchers began to uncover the evidence that these emotional connections are just as important as feeding and bathing and changing a baby's diaper. So, one of the other major phases that we get into is after we've learned how to talk and not eat bugs and how to use the bathroom and all that other stuff, is we also start to develop these skills that are known as our executive function and self-regulation skills. And these are defined as these higher level processes, the things that you and we actually use as adults most of the time, right? So they are our ability to plan, decision-making, problem-solving, actions, taking assignments, making goals, and all that other stuff. In other words, we're talking about things that require access to short-term memory and mental flexibility. If we've got successfully applying all of these skills, then we can retain and access information. We can sustain and shift our attentions, and we're mentally flexible. We don't get overwhelmed when things change up, and we can exercise some self-control. These are major mental processes, and we're not born with these skills. We are born with the potential to develop them. And if we had opportunities through our experiences to learn from adults in our lives, obviously then we're gifted with abilities to make healthy choices for ourselves, and we can contribute positively to society. But what if we didn't get the things that our developing brains needed from the relationships with our caregivers and the key adults? Well, then sometimes these skills can actually be delayed. So then after the brain goes through this mind-boggling process as a little one, Then it enters into this next phase, which starts at 11 years old, and believe it or not, doesn't end until we're 25 years old. How many people in the room right now fall within that category right there? Okay, it's called adolescent brain development phase, and that's another new concept. Because our brains want to be efficient, what researchers believe is happening at this point is now our brain has all those connections that it soaked up while we were little. It's trying to figure out which ones we're going to keep now. And so it's a process of blooming. And then it gets rid of the ones that we don't use that often, which is called pruning. And this helps the brain keep track of these experiences and interactions, all good and bad, storing them up so that it can be accessed at some point in the future. But during this period of the brain, this is where executive function also resides, which is up in this front part. The prefrontal cortex is coming online, and we're starting to develop our adult brain. And now we have, thanks to research, we understand why teenagers behave the way that they do and why they can frustrate us, because that requires a lot of resource planning going on. And while our teenagers look like adults, they don't have a fully formed adult brain yet that we take for granted as an adult, especially as a parent. So teenagers can make bad decisions, they can't stay focused, but more importantly, memory is affected, and they forget things a lot. And while this is frustrating, it's actually incredibly normal, and it's because there's such complexity that's actually going on. So when we're teenagers, think about when you were a teenager. It's really important we get to learn how to make choices and decisions on our own, even if they're dumb ones, because it's important for us to learn cause and effect. But what happens to us sometimes when we're being parented as teenagers is that we've got parents that are telling us what to do, how to do it, and they start to disrupt this process that we've got going on in our heads. Parents can become demanding. They can become frustrated by every choice that a child makes. It can become disruptive to that developing brain. This in turn can lead into behavioral issues that we see, right? It can also start to cause tension between parents and teenagers that happen, because a teenager is also trying to individuate at this point in time. So teenagers are going to take on riskier activities, and I swear, we'll get to business here. When children seem ungrateful and obstinate, that causes the tensions in the house with the parents to increase. And this power struggle can start to actually emerge, and this can actually then create more stress. So another important element of how our brain works is that it doesn't happen in pockets. We don't just work on this brain part and this brain part. The brain is networked together. And so sometimes when we have difficulties focusing on tasks, it's because a different part of the brain is stimulated. It's like, I don't know about you guys, but like my computer has 15 tabs open at the same time, and you're bouncing around. The brain works very similar to that. So while your executive function here in the prefrontal is important for skills that we need for business and maybe even schoolwork, if something else makes us anxious or afraid, it triggers a different part of the brain. It causes us to lose that focus. So that tells us that the prefrontal cortex may not be active. In other words, if your brain senses danger, you can be screwed. So now let's go on here. How does our brain protect us from danger? It makes us feel afraid. So we are wired to survive, to live. And if we're supposed to live, then the way to keep us from doing something that's going to kill us is to make us afraid of doing something. So then this causes this feeling of being triggered. And then it triggers off a response system in the alarm system, which is our fight or flight system, right? Has anybody thought about whether or not you're a fight or a flight person and considered what you do when you're in danger? It's a good thing to kind of figure out for yourself. But basically, when a person confronts danger, like an oncoming car, or maybe it's a dark, scary alleyway, or sometimes it's a weird look on someone's face in a meeting, and you're just like, that didn't sit right with me, the information is fed to the amygdala from your eyes and your ears. The amygdala is an area of the brain that controls our emotional processing. It interprets this danger, and then it sounds an alarm and sends it off to the hypothalamus, okay? But how does the hypothalamus in our brain actually know what danger is? Well, danger scenarios are things that we learned from our experiences. So when you're a child, if there were things that scared you or frightened you, your brain sensed that as danger, no matter what it was. Doesn't even matter if the adults around you didn't think it was very scary. It matters that it affected you and it frightened you. And obviously, things that you do that cause your body pain, those get programmed as danger. If you saw other people getting hurt, that's danger. And it all gets used as future data. So once your amygdala has sensed that something is scary, possibly dangerous, it raises the red flag to the hypothalamus, this tiny region in the brain. It sets off an alarm, and nerve signals start to cascade through your body. That's what you feel when you feel like a sense of being triggered. Fear in your stomach. For me, my chest tightens. Sometimes my gut bottoms out. And so now your body is in fight or flight mode. Cortisol curbs the functions that are non-essential, so you don't feel like eating when you're really stressed out. You also don't do a lot of other functions. Your sex drive might go down for one. And so we'll know that our defense system has clicked in because we actually do feel that in our bodies. So I am fight. I have thought about that. And so one of the other things that happens to me when I'm triggered in is I become angry, because fight means fighting, right? And you can't be nice to somebody. You have to have feelings of hostility, right, in order to survive. Now, this defense mechanism is supposed to be self-limiting. And what that means is it's supposed to shut down after a while. Once the danger's passed, you're supposed to be able to get back to a calm state. But what happens for some people is that the brakes fail, and we stay in this aroused state for a very long time. And that is when the gas is on, we feel threatened all the time. This creates long-term activation of stress response systems, overexposure to cortisol and other stress hormones that can disrupt our body's processes. And for those with anxiety, this is what you feel all the time, right? Common responses to trauma triggers related to, like, if you're a fight person, is yelling, swearing, maybe becoming more aggressive, or you'll see other people doing this. If you have a flight response, you might want to run away. You might start refusing to talk to people. You might start avoiding problems. You might even start to choose to use substance abuse. Freeze, which is the intermittent version, you might start spacing out. You might appear numb, disassociated, disconnected, confused, and unresponsive. Now, you'd sit there and ask yourself, well, maybe we should just avoid stress, right? That would make it so that we're all like nice and calm. Wouldn't that be amazing? But the reality is that stress is also how we learn, and it's actually not all bad for us. So we have to think about the different types of stress and measure it by the effects on the body. First, positive stress is the things that can be triggered by normal events. If you're a little kid and you go to daycare and you're freaking out, right? We drop our kids off, they're panicked. First day of school, first day at a job. Those are normal. We'll have a brief increase in our heart rate. It'll come back down. We'll all feel good. We've re-regulated ourselves. That's positive. And it helps us learn how to be a little bit more brave. But the next part of stress is something that's called tolerable stress, when the alarm systems go off, but they might be a little bit more severe, like the death of a loved one, a natural disaster that scares us, or a frightening injury. Now, when children are in elevated stresses like this, then they may need the emotional support of an adult around them that can help them re-limit and re-regulate. But what happens when a child is experiencing frequent, strong, or prolonged adversity without any appropriate adult interventions? Well, if this happens, the constant surging of hormones to the body can actually begin to develop those neural connections in there. It can lead to some impairments. And not to mention, it actually has a negative effect on the body, like the immune system, the cardiovascular system, and other body functions. And we've learned that too in the last 20 years. And in fact, some children can actually experience post-traumatic stress disorder. That is from the compounding of multiple stressful events throughout their entire life, gives them that sense of they're over-responding all the time. And there are many adults, including myself, that have actually been diagnosed with complex PTSD because I had to start to make sense of some of these extreme responses to emotional situations. And so then the term toxic stress was coined by the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child to capture the growing and extensive knowledge about the effects of constant and prolonged activation of the stress response system. And so what causes stress? Okay, well, this is where we start to talk about trauma. Natural disasters that I've mentioned, right? Human-caused accidents, war cause trauma. School violence can cause trauma. Seeing people being beaten or bullied in school. Our families are a great source of trauma. Family trauma includes abuse, neglect, witnessing violence, watching family members abuse alcohol, having somebody, the loss of a loved one. But there's also experiences that most of us have written off as normal childhood experiences, like divorce. Growing up in a house where bad behavior was corrected with punishments and spanking, or the silent treatment, right? Like, a lot of people were like, that's not trauma, that's just the way we did it on our block back in the 80s. But then we can also see refugees and immigrants experience trauma from war and political violence, being displaced. Medical trauma can happen when we suffer accidents, injuries, or born with disabilities. And then there's the trauma associated with poverty. A lot of people don't think of poverty as a source of trauma, but it comes because you have a lack of resources, you don't have support networks, you don't have financial abilities. There's stress on you from that. And then there's historical trauma, which is groups of people that have been persecuted, discriminated against, or stereotyped, or systematically prosecuted over the course of time, and that mindset just travels from generation to generation. That it can include Native American populations, LGBT communities. We've seen it with Japanese Americans. And then, of course, there's racial trauma, right? This is directly experiencing racial harassment, threats of harm, microaggressions, hate crimes. And at the end of the day, the size of these traumas don't matter. Like, there isn't one of those lists that ends up being more important than the other. The difference is what happened to you and how it affected you as a child, and whether or not you had the buffer of a caring, supportive adult in your life. Positive and tolerable stress responses, when you have a responsible adult around you to cushion the child, those are good, those are normal, those are survivable. Toxic stress is from the experiences that interfere with the basic brain-building activity of serve and return. A child sent out a distress signal, and no one was there to answer it. And then one thing that might be most concerning of all is that emotional neglect, or not having consistent and supportive appropriate responses to that little mind of ours that's always asking questions, is like a death by 1,000 cuts. And so if you had parents that weren't emotionally available to you, it got in the way of that basic serve and return programming. And that's why they have found in the recent years that emotional neglect is kind of a big deal when it comes to childhood and our experiences and these skills that we're supposed to learn, that we're supposed to use as business people to be successful. We've all heard the phrase that kids can figure it out. Well, yeah, kids can. But the truth is we don't figure it out well. It's only if, as a last result, if the adults aren't around. And so one last thread before I bend this arc right back into business again. Now, I could be wrong, but I'm guessing that most of you didn't grow up in the extreme conditions of a Romanian orphanage, right? But I want to talk to you about a groundbreaking study from 1999 called the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. Has anybody in this room heard of that study? Okay, a couple of people. 1999, and it was with CDC and Kaiser Permanente, and they interviewed 17,000 people. And what they found was adverse childhood experiences, divorce, experiencing abuse, having a parent with a mental health condition, there's 8 other items on there, are actually very common, even among a middle-class population. 2/3 of the population report experiencing at least one of these adverse childhood experiences, and nearly a quarter have experienced 3 or more. And when you get to the 3 number, your term or your future and long-term consequences are not looking good for you in terms of health conditions and other mental health conditions. And so these adverse experiences do carry on with us throughout our lives. That's a tough number sometimes for people to get, especially if they feel like they've survived their childhood, to think that there's a long-term consequence there. But Dr. Janice Webb, who's somebody that I've had on my show, wrote a book called Running on Empty, which is overcoming your childhood emotional neglect, noticed a hallmark, however, with parents or her clients who seemed to come from loving families, caring families, but still found themselves in therapy because they had a lot of dissatisfaction with their life. And what she was also seeing is that the absence of this key emotional serve and return between her clients and their caregivers was really the root of some of the challenges that they actually faced. And some of these challenges are the challenges we face in business. A feeling of being lazy, procrastinating, not being able to meet deadlines, maybe overindulgence. I've seen business owners do that with money. Bored when it's too slow. Avoid detailed tasks. I mean, the list goes on. And that's because having a caring parent, you can still end up missing out on giving your children opportunities to be challenged in ways that they learn how to learn some of this self-control because you were there for them. No parent is perfect, so for the parents in the room, myself included, we're going to mess this up a few times, right? And in fact, I'm sure all of you, and most of you in here, feel like you have a really great loving relationship with your parents, so I'm not bashing parents and people watching that, please know that. Parents are struggling to figure out what they're trying to do, and they all want to do what's best for their child. And emotionally neglectful parents also tend to come from emotionally neglectful families themselves, and so they don't even know that they're doing it, and I've been that person as well. Okay, so what does this have to do with starting a business? Well, let's circle this back and let's go to the beginning. Mounting research from neuropsychology and neuroscience and psychology tell us that the core capabilities that adults learn to manage life are being able to plan, being able to focus on what's important at any given time, having the ability to self-regulate and control how we respond to negative situations, having an awareness of other people and their experiences around us, and having some mental flexibility so that we can dodge and weave and move with the changes. And why would anybody have any difficulties with these skills? Well, the research has told us that early adverse traumas, and childhood dysfunction can lead to higher levels of living with stress and having toxic stress responses, which then leads to higher risk of a disruption in learning these skills. And if that's the case, and we happen to be in a threatening and chaotic and unpredictable environment, which I will tell you, starting your own business or working sometimes in business is exactly that kind of environment, we're going to probably start to show even more poor self-regulation behaviors and impulse control. And it's going to look a little bit like maybe you're chasing after fun projects, or you can't finish your deadlines, or you're just so overwhelmed you don't even know where to start today. We might start to feel powerlessness. We might have low sense of self-efficacy. And sometimes when we get into entrepreneurship, we decide we want to start our business because we're attracted to this idea of making more money. And this could be the result of living in a situation where we were financially strapped and feeling the burdens of not having enough to make ends meet. But poverty can also overload our self-regulation process because we're dealing with that constant stress. So as a result, many adults who have grown up and raised in conditions with significant stress or are currently undergoing significant stress that a pandemic, for example, might bestow on us, struggle to keep track of a lot of things going on in their lives. They have problems analyzing the best solutions, coming up with ways to deal with them, and making priorities for how to proceed. Because stress will hijack our good intentions, and it increases the likelihood that we're going to get swept away. And so if we manage to develop good business plans or a to-do list of priorities, but we find it harder to stick up to it if we are under a pile of stress. And so this boils down to a simple equation. The quality of your childhood experiences equals the quality of the adult skills that you developed. And those then equal the predicted success of your business skills. And so if your adult skills require some fine-tuning, which based on that ACEs research tells us there's a 50 to 66% chance that they do to some extent, then the probability is you decide to go into entrepreneurship are going to have some problems associated with it. Now, when you think about the fact that half of us have some exposure to adverse childhood experiences and half of businesses end up failing within 5 years, well, that's a funny coincidence, right? And that the major reasons for business failures indicated are related to poor executive function skills. Now, I suppose that could just be the luck of the draw, but I wouldn't have written the book if I really thought that was the case. But these experiences, whether you classify them as traumatic or not, and you get to leave and decide how you want to label your life and what happened to you, and believe me, I've met many people who either blame themselves for the reason why they were, like, you know what, I was just a bad kid. My parents did everything they could and I just couldn't figure life out. Or they think they deserved it. Or because of how common their childhood felt, look at all their friends and think, well, we all did fine. This is the way we all grew up. You might not have thought that trauma is a word you'd use for yourself. And you might think that it might be a little bit too extreme. But our experiences shape our communication styles and how we relate to people. They shape our belief systems about ourselves and our place in the world. And if they shape whether or not we end up evolving and developing courage and confidence to be ourselves. These experiences made us the type of people that can pick themselves up after defeats or have caused us to become too fearful and too vigilant about every disaster that could be waiting for us. These experiences instill in us our sense of self-worth and value, and when it comes to how to be treated, and this is really important to business, how to be paid financially. And all of this is a tragedy that I say that we end up living twice. First, when we're children, and we are forced to figure out our own emotional needs and skills. And second, when we become adults, and we're judged by the results. So now what? Well, so if you're able to take away from this that we have a software system running in the background that could get in the way of your best intentions, you might be asking, okay, well then what do I do about this? Like, is there a way to uninstall the system? And so moving forward, the answer is yes, there is. But there are 3 things that I really want you to be mindful as you leave today. One is realize that procrastination, anxiety, poor focus, etc., these are biological responses triggered by something that happened to you or is happening to you in your life right now. And these are physical responses you can actually feel thanks to hormones being flooding in your bloodstream. Therefore, if you've really never thought about yourself in this way, the first thing to do is start to become mindful of when you're becoming triggered, whether it's at work or at home. Know what your fight or flight feelings actually feel and look like. So every time your stress system gets activated, then what you do is you hit the button and pause. See if you can't start to freeze yourself for a moment and just get curious. Don't tell yourself to stop feeling anxious. Don't have that voice in your head that tells you there's nothing you should be upset about. The point isn't to judge yourself. The point is to start to notice it and to be able to start to keep track of it so you can come back to it later. Because what you want to start to figure out is, am I really in danger right now at this moment? Or, oh my gosh, interesting, is this a response based on a memory that I need to unpack at some point? Now, remember, step 2, that change is actually possible. So, if you sit here and think, man, I'm screwed, like this is not going to go well for me, I want you to actually become aware of these points that you're activated, because you can probably figure out what's causing them and actually be able to remodel your brains. What we have discovered about our brains is that they aren't a fixed state like we thought, that you don't lose brain cells and they never come back. There is this principle called neuroplasticity, which is the ability for humans to actually form and rewire some of those connections that we have in our brains through a process of blooming and pruning again. And so neuroplasticity to me is how we are able to coach and how we're able to use therapy to be able to improve the well-being of people's lives. So once you're able to identify connections that you need to change, like why do I get triggered in a meeting like this? That's something that I'd like to be able to do differently. And hitting that pause button, you can actually stop your regular responses and start to do something different. And that actually starts to institute that process of pruning out the old response and blooming in a new one. But I need you guys to remember one thing. That's the third part, that grace is necessary. You know that a lot of these things can undermine our abilities to successfully perform as a business person. And they're due to the fact that we have these adult abilities and we apply adult thinking to situations, but they're in conflict with the experiences that were programmed when we were children. And so we have to give ourselves a grace, because if we've been using these neurons over and over and over again, they're pretty well rehearsed. And so when we talk about how childhood trauma impacts us, it's important to remember that your little brain made those connections that were important for you to survive when you were a child and to thrive in that environment. Those connections were central to you being able to understand your world when you were small and your brain was most sensitive. And they may not be working for you right now, but it was the right connection for that time. And so if you've done that a lot, and use them a lot, it will take time for them to become undone. So cut yourself some slack, and also recognize that some things will never change in our lives. Like there are some responses in my body that I will always be triggered by. What I can change is how I respond and react to them once I realize that I'm actually being triggered by something. And so the adult skills that we need are the successful business skills that we need. And that we weren't born with these skills, but they had to be taught to us and modeled to us and shown to us. And that if you're struggling with these skills, I want you guys all to remember that it's not your fault, okay? I'll say that again. We were supposed to have been taught these skills, and if we didn't get those opportunities and those experiences, and they are something that we struggle with in business and entrepreneurship, it's not your fault. So at the beginning, I told you about the hero's journey and this return home for me, right? And so what is the message that I wanted you to hear? Well, I gave you this rundown on neuroscience. I wove it back into business. Hopefully you guys left and you took something from it. But I tricked you because I did promise through the videos that were shown on campus that I was going to show you how you could be more successful in business. And hopefully I did that. I gave you some insights onto how that can be. But this is really what I wanted you guys to leave with today. I'm not here to tell you about my hero's journey and that it ends here with me, sharing you the boons of my labor. For you that are out there, and for some of you that are watching this video, I want this to be your call to adventure. Let's suppose you're not going to be an entrepreneur and go into business for yourself. You're still going to have a job. And if you're getting a business degree, you're probably aiming for some leadership positions out there. And so how does all of this stuff then affect you? High rates of trauma among employees and business leaders can have significant negative effects on the workplace climate, its culture, and the conditions for people to be able to do their jobs. And so when people are struggling with their trauma responses, they're more likely to escalate and act out in ways that can actually be counterproductive to positive work experiences for themselves and for everybody around them. And if you have a business environment that's built on fear and crisis, employees then become reactive and may even become rigid. For example, managers may be quick to threaten employees with negative consequences and escalate with their staff. They might use punitive strategies in an attempt to control and get better performance out of their employees. And when people feel powerless to address the trauma, they're bringing it into work. It's there with them every day. And when you have trauma, it doesn't leave you. It's a backpack on your back. Then sometimes they unintentionally deny the trauma or silence other people around them, right? Like, if I can't take care of my problems, I'm going to punish you for those problems. And they can end up minimizing or overlooking the effects that trauma have on other people. And under these circumstances, businesses actually risk re-traumatizing employees by creating environments and situations that end up replicating and mirroring trauma that we've experienced, causing them to experience similar levels of stress in the present. Re-traumatizing practices that we see in business include harsh discipline, yelling at your employees. Those look like abuse that some people may have had to grow up with. Allowing environments to become chaotic and disorganized and unpredictable and unsafe. Treating employees disrespectfully and minimizing their voice. When a business or work environment is affected by trauma, safety, engagement, and a sense of community amongst employees is compromised. And what do we call those places? We call them toxic work environments. And there are consultants that get paid a ton of money to come in and help businesses figure out how to undo that. Ultimately, believe it or not, the side effects of unaddressed trauma that we bring with us and we experience with the people around us can compromise a business's mission and its purpose. And so when we look at our lives and our parents' lives and someday our children's lives, and mine are sitting in the back of the room, where will jobs and businesses and professions fit in? Every day, all day, we work, right? We either become entrepreneurs or we become employees, or we are the employees. And how often does that work experience end up shaping our home experience? Well, how often do we see our parents struggling with money, job stress, lousy bosses, terrible coworkers? How often have we experienced that in our jobs? A huge component of the fact that still 2 out of 3 children today are experiencing trauma is due to their parents and their parents' job, or maybe even lack thereof. People are triggered, traumatized, and re-traumatized at work daily. Sexual harassment, verbal harassment, workplace violence, discrimination, all live at that dark end of that spectrum, while at the other end is bullying, rankism, microaggressions, aggressiveness, hostility, and sometimes just normal misunderstandings in communication. And so, do I think that it's fair that only college-educated business students and people watching on the video get access to these secrets? No. But you all are in the room, or you're watching this video. If you applied a little bit of what you've learned to what I've said today to your life and to your business life, and you recognize the signs of trauma and triggers in yourselves and others, you realize how sad and complicated histories that half of us are carrying with us on a daily basis can come into the workplace. And then you begin to learn how you can respond with sensitivity to these people rather than re-triggering them, and you can resist re-traumatizing or re-triggering your employees, then maybe there's a better day for all of us. Because if there's one thing we do know is that we can pass down trauma from generation to generation. But we have to remember that we can also do the opposite. We can actually begin to pass down hope. And so what I believe, and why I do this, and why I will continue to do this, is that I believe in the abilities that we all have to make these changes. That some of you will take this tonight that I talked about, nibble on it, look at it in your own lives, talk about it with your friends and your classmates and instructors, stay curious, stay skeptical even, be rebellious. I would do the same thing. And then imagine what your company would look like if we all became trauma-informed and we ran businesses like that. Do you believe that you'd be able to change the lives of employees in positive ways? And further, do you believe it would change the lives of those people and their personal lives and to their children's lives? Businesses and work environments are the last greatest frontier for bringing this awareness, and every leader and organization that begins to apply trauma-informed will have a noticeable impact on our communities. But to be a modern-day hero, or in this case a business leader, to heed that call means that you can't wait for everyone else to change their perspectives or to give up on the misunderstandings of what they believe that we used to know about behavior or parenting or success. It's the leader's role to share with society, even when it's not easy, to drive these changes. And in The Hero of a Thousand Faces, Campbell noted that sometimes, in myth as well as real life, sometimes heroes refuse the call to adventure. They turn away from opportunities like this because they're driven to maintain what they believe is their own self-interest. And so I know today, statistically speaking, half of you in this room or watching live aren't pulling a heavy sled of past trauma with you everywhere you go. You might be intrigued by what I just said, but you probably don't think it matters to you. But it does matter, and that's what leadership is. It matters to our communities. It matters to our future. And if you're inclined to view this in a pragmatic way, it matters to the bottom line. There are real business expenses related to turnover, recruiting, lawsuits, and employee engagement-oriented factors that are usually connected back to trauma. And so this is for everybody in the room, the students and the instructors, the parents and the children. We are in the midst of one of the most disruptive human moments in history. A global pandemic has changed us, and it's changed the workplace. People, it and all the other historical events of the past year have traumatized all of us. And again, for about half of us, this past year has been even harder than it is for the other half of everybody because of everything I talked about. And so as we re-enter this new form of normal, what is that going to look like? As Campbell wrote, "But whether small or great, and no matter the stage or grade of life, the call rings up the curtain, and it's always on a mystery of transfiguration, a rite or a moment of spiritual passage, which when complete amounts to a dying and a birth. The familiar life horizon has been outgrown. The concepts and ideals and the emotional patterns no longer fit. The time for the passing of a threshold is at hand." And so that I hope today that you all are ready to answer the call to cross a threshold to bring this more sensitive and compassionate and human form of leadership into business and entrepreneurship. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amee. I would like to implore those of you who have those index cards, please, we'll have Carly and Debbie from K-State. We'll walk around and collect those, and we'll try to do some Q&A. But in the meantime, while we do that, we actually have, as promised, 2 copies of Amee's book, The Fearless Woman's Guide to Starting a Business. As you know, it's interesting because when Amee got here today, this was the first time she held her own book in her own hands.
Yeah.
So that was pretty exciting to see that. All these months and years of her passion come true as she put this book together. So get your tickets out. She's going to draw 2 winners. So here is winner number 1.
Somebody's feeling lucky out there. 2244805.
Hey, there we go.
Awesome.
Okay, hold on. What we'll do is we'll have you pick it up at the end of the. And by the way, these are autographed.
Yeah.
It is autographed.
Hold your horses, everybody. Yeah.
Here we go. Okay, come find me after the presentation. Okay.
Okay. 2244804. Well, that's not fair. I picked them 2 side by sides. Awesome. There you go.
Thank you so much. Do we have some Q&As?
Okay.
We got a few?
So, and tomorrow night too, I'll be at Ad Astra. So if for anybody that wants to talk about the book stuff, and I mean, you're welcome there. If you want to talk to me about whatever, I mean, I've been holed up in my house for like a year, so I'm in to talk about anything with anybody at this point. Oh, we got a loaded question from the audience here. Who wants to know if I had a good childhood. I will tell you, or how would I describe my childhood? I have said this before, that when you take a look at what constitutes trauma, adversity, dysfunction, I have met in my time, in my years of doing this, especially with my show, One Broken Mom, I talked to some people, and I've met some people who have gone through the most unimaginable experiences that just, I am so in awe of some of these people that I meet. I'm not one of those people. I mean, I just be honest with you. In fact, I have said that I feel like a lot of what I thought was the norm is not that unusual for a lot of other people. I do know, my uncle's here, my kids are here. It wasn't easy for me as a childhood. And when I moved away, there were reasons for that. And one is that this wasn't my place anymore for me. And so, good, I lived, that's cool, right? And there's good moments and bad moments. But what I discovered much later was that there were a lot of things that happened that were not good. And they hurt me for a long time until I was able to figure that out. And so a lot of people do find that, I feel like life was normal. Like, it was all right, it was good. But then they have this thing that just kind of still sets them off and triggers them, or they can't speak up for themselves in a meeting, or, I've had some abusive personal relationships. Like, you don't get into that without having some funk in the background and that you need to unpack and take care of. And so I've seen worse and I've seen better. So I think that, the short answer is I feel like my childhood is average, to be honest, and that's not good enough. Because average right now is a pretty low bar, in my opinion, for what we could actually get out of life. So, all right, that's the question of the night. Okay, well, I'd like to thank everybody that's here. If any other questions do come up later, because sometimes people can be shy, go ahead and email me. You can reach out to your instructors and find me. Again, if you also want to come by Ad Astra tomorrow and ask something else. I do encourage you, like I said, I meant this tonight. It sounded all flowery at the end, but there's a real opportunity to be able to learn a lot about yourselves. And one of the important things, especially since all of you that raised your hands under the age of 25, think of your mental health as investing. I'm sure you've been told by your teachers, if you start investing money today, you get the benefit of compound interest. And I will tell you that if you're making the investment in yourself right now at this age, it works just like money. You can come off of a pathway, and it seems like really small right now, but by the time you're my age, in your 40s, it can be astronomically different and better. I don't want to see people have to get to their 40s to start to figure out how they could have done things a lot differently for themselves, especially if they have kids that they worry about. And so for all of you right now, think about what I said and think about what you could start to do that would have some positive impacts and start to be able to set you off in a different direction, because like compound interest, it will magnify exponentially over your life. So, and for those of you that were forced to come here because it was a class requirement, thank you anyways. All right, thank you.